A lot of us are aware that the South Asian region is in crisis at the moment. There's been a rise of right-wing governments, right-wing forces of all kinds. And what we have ourselves highlighted is the attacks on minorities, on workers, in some parts of South Asia on the left, on Dalits, and the really horrific scale of this, the mob lynchings in India, the attacks on Rohingyas, of course, the genocidal attacks, and similarly also in the other countries of Sri Lanka, of South Asia. But what maybe we, at least in Britain, have not focused on is that while it's an attack on minorities and dissenters and human rights violations, there's also a war on women which is going on in this context. We know that, of course, the region is one where patriarchy in general is pretty extreme. Violence against women has been going on for a long time. But we see a really very serious increase in this violence and this patriarchal control. We see attacks on women just for being on the streets in some cases. The attacks on Dalit women have escalated since the Modi government in India came in, for example. There have been, just to give examples from India, the Chief Minister of Uttar Pradesh was present at a meeting where people were urging others to dig up the graves of Muslim women and rape the corpses. So this is the kind of thing which has become almost commonplace. So that is the focus of our meeting today. Now, having said that, I'd just like to say something about the nature of the crisis, or at least to give you something which we can expand on and think about as well as we go along. Now, this week we have had the news of major attacks on Muslims in Sri Lanka by the Sinhalese Buddhists. And there's been the imposition of an emergency, which of course is nothing new in Sri Lanka. And this is something, the attacks on Muslims is something which has been escalating from the end of the war. It's almost as though the Sinhala Buddhist majority want another enemy to go on attacking. So we want to, of course, look at the position of women within all of this. Now, what we must also emphasize for the region as a whole is that it's not only women from the minorities who are being attacked. It's women within, for example, in India, the Hindutva forces attack women simply for being women. We have leaders of the RSS saying that women should be housewives, that their duty is to look after their husbands. We have other RSS figures saying that Draupadi was the first feminist. Draupadi was a mythical figure who had 5 husbands. So this is supposed to be deeply feminist. We have the chief minister of another state in India saying that the Khap panchayats, which are basically kangaroo courts of a very feudal nature, that they are the perfect instrument for ruling the country, the countryside. So this is the arena we'll be looking at in our meeting today. I'd like to, I have to also tell you that ISABEL MARLER, who was going to be speaking about Rohingyas, is unable to be with us today. She's actually was suddenly called to a meeting in America where she's talking on the identical topic. But she sent us a video message which we will have a listen to, and I thought we could hear that first and then maybe look at certain questions where you could also reflect on it if you wish, but you could talk about the particular the particular situations in each of the South Asian countries. I would like to introduce the other speakers, but I think I'll do that after we've had the film and you're all sitting up here.
Hello, thanks so much for having me to participate in this event, and I'm really sorry that I'm not able to be with you in person. Before getting into it, I'll make a small introduction about where I'm coming from. My work focuses on the gender dynamics of religious fundamentalisms, fascisms and nationalisms on a global level, and as part of this work I've been looking into the resurgence of Buddhist nationalism. I've been in touch with various activists within Burma, so I'm lucky enough to be able to share insights from them here, as well as building on the work of other researchers and the work of my colleague Macarena Aguilar, who I've been writing with jointly on this topic. So first, some thoughts on Buddhist nationalism and how gender operates in this ideology. At the heart of the ideology, there's an idea that Burmese Buddhism is under threat and that it needs to be protected from external and internal enemies, primarily enemies in the form of the Muslim population. There's an idea that Muslim men are a threat to Buddhist women and to the purity of the nation. There's resistance to interfaith and intercommunity marriages and a desire to stop or regulate these marriages. There's a kind of demographic anxiety that comes with this central notion of purity of the nation, and the idea that to be Burmese and to be Buddhist are basically synonymous. As you can tell, there's a lot of striking similarities with the discourses you hear in Hindu nationalism, as well as the kind of anti-Muslim rhetoric you hear in Europe and in North America as well. That said, the dynamics at play are also very locally rooted, for sure. There's this idea that Burma, along with Sri Lanka, is the last bastion of Buddhism in Asia, and a lot of people will refer to other Asian places like Indonesia as examples of where Islam has pushed out Buddhism from Asia. For Rakhine State in particular, where most of the Rohingya population are located, on the border with Bangladesh, it's viewed as the Western Gate through which Islam threatens to take over the country, basically. The most notable group at play is the Mabata, which is a Burmese acronym for a longer name which translates to the Association for Protection of Race and Religion. They're a decentralised organisation made up of laypersons and of religious figures. And this movement does have close links with Buddhist nationalism in Sri Lanka, so there's definitely a transnational element to what's happening. Many of these religious figures, as prominent monks, have spread extremely dehumanising rhetoric about the Rohingya population. There's been examples where monks have described them as being reincarnated from snakes or insects, suggesting that therefore that they're not fully human, or using other religious passages to claim that killing non-Buddhists is somehow morally permittable. The prominent narrative is that the Rohingya don't have a claim to citizenship, that they're illegal immigrants, and from the people that I've spoken to, this narrative is quite largely accepted by Buddhist Burmese people. Even those who might really oppose the very violent kind of hate speech would probably be okay with this narrative of the illegal immigrant, and wouldn't use the term Rohingya to describe them, but would call them Bengalis. And the backdrop to this is extreme repression of the press, extreme control of the media, no freedom of expression. So there's a very high level of censorship and of propaganda in the country, which is certainly a big factor. To say something more about the gendered impacts of the movement, I'll first mention the race and religion legislation which was passed in 2015. So this was a major win for the Buddhist nationalists. They'd lobbied for these laws to come into place. there are a set of laws which restrict various things, including Buddhist women wishing to marry non-Buddhist men, forcing non-Buddhist men to convert to Buddhism before marrying Buddhist women. It also bans polygamy across communities, but arguably targeting Muslim populations where this is practiced more prevalently. In terms of the current atrocities in Rakhine State, there is a heavy gender dimension as well. Human rights groups have been documenting widespread, systematic sexual violence against Rohingya, and have shown that there's a lack of gender-sensitive support services for survivors who are now residing in refugee camps. Interestingly, the Buddhist nationalist movement has a really large support base amongst Buddhist women. And actually many of the active members in Mabata, the female members, they will refer to feminism and women's rights as motivators for their activity within the Mabata. So they have this sense that protecting their religion and protecting women's rights are very much linked. They're not in contradiction. They see the race and religion laws as good for women, for protecting their rights in marriage. And in practice, this movement does give them access to political space, to a platform to share their concerns. It gives them opportunities that they might not find elsewhere in society in terms of education and employment. So it's quite an interesting case. They're part of this movement which is dehumanising the Rohingya and contributing to conditions in which a genocide can be carried out, but they don't see it that way. They see themselves as taking a stand for women's rights and for their religion. This is probably able to happen, I'd say, in part because the Mabata operates on a very multi-levelled approach. They have these very extreme statements from some figures on the one hand, but then on the other hand they deliver a huge amount of normal community services, so disaster relief, education, schooling, support in times of hardship. They provide legal aid to women fighting cases of abuse in marriage, for example. So all this has kind of given them this widespread grassroots support and a kind of respectable image amongst some people as a normal religious community organisation. Having said that, there's other parts to the picture. There are women who have taken part in more direct actions. There have been cases where women's NGOs have protested at internally displaced persons camps in Rakhine, protested against the aid that was being given to the Rohingya population, for example. There's been reports of Buddhist nationalist women actively, physically blocking pregnant Rohingya women from leaving the camps to access medical attention. So that's kind of the other side of women's engagement in this movement. And I guess while there's a lot of local specificity, I think there are trends that are in keeping with kind of more global trends. It's definitely in keeping with the research that we've done at my organisation, AWID, which shows that more and more these groups, these fundamentalist movements are using kind of this narrative of women's rights or human rights and kind of co-opting progressive language in the service of these really oppressive agendas. Of course, with these movements like Buddhist nationalism, where anti-Islam sentiment is so central to it, of course there's another layer of significance because Islam is portrayed as uniquely oppressive to women, and that's a way to mobilise support amongst the whole community. But we do see it across different religious trends, for sure.
So we're very excited to have this amazing panel of speakers today. We've tried as far as possible to cover a number of areas in South Asia. So let me just go one by one and introduce everybody. Well, nearest me is Meena Kandasamy, well-known poet and novelist and activist. And she's going to be talking about the situation in India. Then we have MAHVISH AHMAD, who is the co-editor of feminist magazine Tanqeed from Pakistan, and also involved in left politics in Pakistan. And then we have Goldie Osuri, who is from the University of Warwick, and she's a researcher into Kashmir and sovereignty and gender. Then we have AKANKSHA Mehta, who is from the University of Sussex, and she is going to be looking at this very interesting issue of the links between Hindutva and Zionism. Then we have Nirmala Rajasingam, who is going to be talking about Sri Lanka. She's an activist and a writer and a member of South Asia Solidarity Group. And then we have Mehroosh Tak, who is a Kashmiri scholar, an activist and feminist. So we do have a really fantastic panel here for you. So I'd like to just start it off by asking our panelists if they'd like to reflect on any particular case or incident which illustrates this whole question of gender and the rise of the right. So, who would like to start? You want to go?
I think we should start here.
Yeah.
Right there.
Oh no, I traveled a lot to come here, so I want to catch up.
Okay, I can just, yes. I can just say a couple of thank you so much for having me and such an amazing group of women, and happy International Women's Day as well. I'm of course starting from Pakistan, which in terms of all of the South Asia countries is particular because the rise of the right is also associated with Islamophobia so deeply, and Pakistan's 96% Muslim, so we have a very different kind of situation there. So I hope I won't talk too long, but I just want to shortly reflect on what rise of the right means in a place like Pakistan, because I'll just open my notes here. Because I think I'll have to. I know that there's a case that you want me to talk about, and the case that I wanted to reflect on was the passage of the domestic violence bill in 2016, a landmark legislation that was passed in the Punjab Assembly. And of course, we had a backlash from the religious right, and then we went on the streets and we protested them. But before, is it okay that I say a little bit about that? Yeah, because I mean, just to sort of put it into perspective, there's been this rise of the right everywhere, and it's been associated with fascist politicians coming into government power. And it's interesting because in Pakistan we do have an Islamist right, but we don't vote them into power, which I'm very proud of. That they never get our votes. They are militants, or they do get a couple of seats in parliament, but it's never particularly significant. Having said that, there is a very significant right, and when it comes to Pakistan, it emerged much earlier and is linked to imperial intervention in the 80s against the Soviet Union and Afghanistan, but also as a result, the right is deeply linked to an alliance between a bureaucratic military state apparatus and foreign imperial powers. And that puts, when it comes to gender violence issues, women a lot of times in a kind of a double bind, which a lot of other people have talked about. So I wanted to speak very shortly about the domestic violence bill, and when it was passed, and I was in Pakistan, a member of both the Awami Workers' Party, which is a socialist party in Pakistan, who were of course very happy that the bill was passed, and a member of the Feminist Collective, which is a sort of a younger group of feminists who were passed. And the important part of the I guess the interesting thing is, if you look at the passage of this particular domestic violence bill and the kind of backlash from the right, what's interesting, I don't want to get into too much detail about the bill, but I want to talk about some of the things that were happening around the bill that made feminist organizing against this bill slightly complicated. Parallel to the passage of the domestic violence bill, the Pakistani state executed Mumtaz Qadri. Mumtaz Qadri was the man who had killed Salman Taseer. Simultaneously and parallel to that, Sharmeen Obaid Chinoy also won the Oscars for her documentary on acid killings. And we also had a couple of other things happen, like Gandil Baloch was killed. She was this social media star, very sort of sexually, it was all over the news. I hope I'm getting a little bit confused with it, but when it came to, for example, what you had was we were united on the question of the domestic violence bill, but when it came to other forms of violence that we also see, not just in terms of other forms of violence that also affect women's lives, especially state violence, especially imperial violence, that's a point where the feminist movement has systematically broken and not being able to be united around that question. So for example, Sharmeen Obaid Chinoy has been amazing with her documentaries on acid victims, but when it came to refugees from the war on terror running away from the tribal areas after an army operation, she tweeted out that we shouldn't let them into Karachi because they're a bunch of terrorists. And then she had to pull that back, right? Or when you had Mumtaz Gagri assassinated by the state, you had a lot of very prominent liberal feminists come out and say, this is amazing, the state is finally giving the death penalty. And so these kind of things means that, when it comes to sort of the classic gender violence cases within Pakistan, domestic violence and things, you have this funny kind of situation where feminists find themselves having, because the right wing, especially because the right wing isn't elected into power, because they're marginal, then feminists, we find ourselves as feminists trying to ally ourselves both with a state that is violent in itself, violent in other ways, and of course allying ourselves with the British High Commission or USAID, because they're also willing to fund us. And this keeps on coming up as an issue. Asma Jahangir, who we were incredibly brokenhearted to bury not so long ago, was amazing on this point because in her work in the Human Rights Commission of Pakistan, she refused to take funding from the US. She took funding a little bit, but usually like Norwegian government or something. But these kind of splits within the feminist movement make it incredibly difficult because Muslim women are the ones who are saved by others, and then feminists are like, okay, well then how do you, and so you find significant sections of the feminist movement not being vocal enough, I think, on other forms of violence that also affect women. So the situation in Pakistan is a little bit particular in that way. So I'll stop talking.
Thank you, that is really interesting because that reflects so much of what we feel here in this country as well. So we need to have more of a discussion on that. But Goldie, would you like to talk about Kashmir?
So I just thought I would respond to that question by speaking about the case of Asifa Bano, who some of you may have already heard of, and that case is currently ongoing. But before I just talk about that case a little bit, I just wanted to sort of maybe just ask the question, what does a war on women and the rise of the right look like from the perspective of Kashmiris, right? So I'm not Kashmiri, obviously, but looking at, what does it look like from there? And I think that has a very different history again. So, it's linked to one of the main points that I'm going to make. But just to say, as a framing, is that since the 1990s, the state of Jammu and Kashmir is one of the most militarized zones in the world. It has draconian laws which give impunity to the Indian Armed Forces, and it constitutes an occupation. And this occupation also conducts a gendered war against women in a myriad ways. Rape is one of these instruments of war. Others include things like enforced disappearances, which also affect women disproportionately. And in fact, the Association of Parents of Disappeared Persons, led by Parveena Ahangar, has held a protest today. They hold a protest every 10th of the month. So with the Asifa Bano case, she's an 8-year-old girl who is from the Muslim, Gujjar and Bakarwal communities in Jammu. Okay, so not in the Kashmir Valley. And she was abducted, raped, and tortured for about a week and then killed. As I said, the case has been ongoing. There's a lot of twists and turns. But a special police officer has been arrested along with 2 others. But what is interesting is they are both, the before and the after story of what has happened to Asifa Bano. The before story is that this particular community was already being harassed by the special police officer and others for being Gujar or Bakarwal Muslims in the area. They're also a tribal kind of community. And in the aftermath, there's been huge marches, protest marches, held by the Hindu Ekta Manch and other Hindutva groups who are basically saying that the Jammu and Kashmir crime branch, which is investigating the case, is actually framing this police officer, and they want the case to be transferred to a Central Bureau of Investigation, where they hope they get a fair hearing, but I think what they really mean is they want the case to be watched up even more and not have the special police officer charged with this crime. I think so. This is very much linked to communalism, both in terms of the before and after, as I was saying, because they're Gujar and Bakarwal Muslims. The area is mostly full of Hindu Brahmins, and they've been harassing this community. Also, this communalism is linked to the emergence of tribal rights. So at the moment, there's legislation to give tribal rights for that particular community, and the Hindutva right has been against this. And also, I guess in the aftermath, the double communalization comes from them not just protesting the case, but I guess challenging the PDP government, part of the BJP-PDP alliance that is in the Kashmir Valley. So they're basically saying the Kashmiris are secessionists, they're terrorists. They're also, in their protest marches have been talking about how this particular Gujar Bakarwal Muslim community are a mini Pakistan, and that they should, they're talking about things like population control. They want population control laws so that you don't have mini Pakistans everywhere and so on. So while reading about this case, I was also remembering other human rights reports that I've read about other 8-year-old, 11-year-old girls that have been raped in the 1990s in Kashmir. In 1993, of course, there's the mass rape of women in Kunan Poshpor by the 4th Rajputana Rifles. They continue to wait for justice. It's been 26 years. There's been all sorts of botched investigations and so on. There's a book called Do You Remember Kunan Poshpora by about 5 Kashmiri women, and I'd recommend everyone read it. But one of the interesting things about this Human Rights Watch report in 1993 was that the women's testimonies show that the army was told to rape the women. And so it's a systematic sort of crime. They were actually ordered to rape the women and to criminalize them as wives of terrorists. So the whole Muslim as terrorist narrative is not something new in a way. In a previous era of supposed secular governance, you had Governor Jagmohan in Kashmir at the time, who had publicly made statements like every Muslim is a terrorist and so on in relation to the Kashmir Valley. So I think that actually is sort of disturbs this kind of narrative. At the same time, it's important to chart the rise of the right. But my point, and sort of I've talked about this in a book of mine as well, there's an entanglement between a kind of soft Hindu majoritarian secularism and it's linked to the contemporary, much more overt, much more aggressive Hindu fascism, I would say. So yes, the war on women is identifiable in the rise of the Hindu right, as Amrit and others will, I'm sure, talk about. But it's important to remember that it reveals a continuum and a pattern from India's war in occupied Jammu and Kashmir, waged from both the Hindu majoritarian secularism. So I'm not saying all secularists have this Hindu majoritarian kind of thing, but it's kind of, in a lot of ways, encoded in many of the laws that are already there in the Constitution, and in the secular Constitution. And I don't have time to go into that, but that's one of the points, major points I want to make.
Well, again, there's a lot of links with what's happening here, because we have a big South Asian community who display the same sort of attitudes. And in fact, there's the MP, Bob Blackman, who's very much for the Kashmiri Brahmins, you know, and constantly talking about terrorism. So let's go on to Akanksha.
So I'm going to talk a little bit based on my work. I did an ethnography for my PhD, which involved 14 months with right-wing women in the Hindu nationalist movement and Zionist settlers in the southern West Bank in Palestine. So this is coming from also sort of thinking about why are there so many women involved in these movements, what are they gaining out of them, what is going on, what are the internal dynamics of these movements. I spent about 10 months with women in Durga Bahini, the army of Durga, and Sevika Samiti, the RSS's women's wing in India, and then 4 months living with settlers in the southern West Bank and Palestine to sort of see how their mobilizations happen. I got very messed up in the process. But responding to this particular question, I want to talk about, I don't want to talk about a specific incident or case, because for me I could see patterns that were developing, and all of these were connected to each other, and sometimes they resulted in a particular case that became, that got a lot of media attention or became bigger. But what was more dangerous was to see how they manifested every day systematically in a pattern. So for example, when I spent time with women in Durga Bahini, the two things that came up that they were doing systematically at that point was, one, in every branch, in every locality, they were creating a room called the Love Jihad room. So love jihad, as many of you already might know, is this idea that in the context of Hindu nationalism, that Muslim men of the other, are using romance and love to sort of dupe and trick Hindu women into having relationships with them and then converting them into Islam. So this sort of demonizing the Muslim man again and again, and also in the process extending discourses of protectionism of the Hindu women, that Hindu women must be kept safe from these men. So the women that I spoke to and spent time with, in every local chapter, they were creating a room at the back of the chapter, which was a designated love jihad room, and they would tell me that what we do here is we pick up men, Muslim men that we think are engaged in love jihad, we bring them into this room and we beat them up, and then we bring women, Hindu women, who are involved with these men, and we either also beat them a little bit, and there are videos of this also circulating, but mostly we offer them counseling to sort of bring them back into the Hindu fold and warn them about the dangers of socializing or having friendships with Muslim men. So this room became a sort of very spatialized setting of where violence was conducted routinely, in a way privately because it was inside the chapter, but also very publicly because they would constantly talk about it, constantly talk about monitoring these neighborhoods. They had posters in almost all the active neighborhoods in Delhi, Bombay, Nashik, Pune, when I was with them, where they would warn women about getting on motorcycles with Muslim men and all kinds of ideas around, safety discourses, stay in the house, don't go out, these men are out there waiting for you. So this was one. The other thing that really stood out, and this happened in one of the Bombay chapters that I was spending time with, was that they came up with this idea of the daily walk of violence, where a group of women in the Durga Bahini would get together every day or every other day or whenever they could, and they would drive to this particular Muslim neighborhood or various Muslim neighborhoods. The chapter that I was studying would go to this one particular Muslim neighborhood where they would just walk around the Muslim buildings. And this is a Muslim neighborhood in the sense to explain that in Mumbai in particular, the city is quite religiously divided, and there's a lot of sort of violence and oppression to separate communities and keep them separate, usually around ideas of food. They eat different food, they shouldn't be allowed into these housing societies, those kinds of ideas. So they would go to these so-called Muslim societies and walk around outside shouting slogans, throwing stones, attacking whomever they saw. And in both these cases, it was sort of women that were also unleashing the violence, but also the violence was very gendered. In the first case, in the love jihad case, the violence was gendered in the form of attacking particular Muslim masculinities and also attacking Hindu women and keeping them indoors. And in the second case, when they would go on these daily walks, it was inevitably women who were staying home at these points. It was women and children who would be alone, who would be in the house, who would be doing all kinds of care work, reproductive labor that women were doing in these housing societies. And so they would be the victims of these attacks, which were daily. And the Muslim women were very used to this happening, because I did speak to some of them as well on a different day, asking them that, this happens almost daily, what is going on, how are you responding to this? And they would say, we just ignore them. Sometimes we, throw a stone back at them, and do that, but they have given up on complaining to the police or to other authorities to stop this event from happening. So this was the case. I know we're talking about South Asia, but just to push the parallel into thinking about Zionist settlers, what you were just saying, Goldie, really stayed with me, because there you have settlers who are Zionists who are living in the Palestinian territories. And although they are often described as the extreme right, or the far right, they're the crazy ones and all that, they're just an extension of what is happening in mainland Israel, because there you have the Zionist liberals and other Zionists who are also appropriating land. But in the Palestinian territories in particular, again, daily violence was sort of the way women were mobilizing. There was this idea that we are not fighting in the army anymore. Many of us, of course, all of them were in the army as part of the conscription, but we are no longer in the Israeli army, and our place now is to be these frontier women who are engaged in everyday violence. So the women I was around would often, if they saw a Palestinian car, because you can identify it by the number plate, they would throw a stone at the Palestinian car, they would spit at the Palestinian car, they would say that we block Palestinians from walking. If we see a Palestinian woman, we would just, yell a curse at them. It's a very, these that can be seen as not very spectacular acts of violence, but very consistent, very systematic, very everyday acts of violence. And one of my interlocutors from the Zionist organization told me that, this is how we can be mothers, grandmothers, wives, everything else, and still continue to be soldiers. So we just make these acts, a part of our daily routine. So this is sort of what I wanted to say, that instead of looking at a specific case, for me, it is sometimes more important to look at the continuity of these cases and how they've become part of daily life, and what they might be offering to these women in the right wing who are perpetuating and strengthening nationalism and settler colonialism in the case of Zionists. That's right.
Thank you. Okay. I was thinking about what does it mean, the rise of the right in the context of Sri Lanka. And one of the major, mainly, particularly in the West, discussions about Sri Lanka center around the 30 Year War, the Tamil national struggle, and all the violence that women experienced during the Tamil women experience during that period, and from the various marauding armies that came into the Tamil regions. But I want to talk today about a matter that is not discussed much, which is a parallel story to this 30-year war, because it almost historically, as far as the time is concerned, it starts at that point. In 1977, Sri Lanka was the first South Asian country to open up the country to foreign investment and multinational exploitation of cheap labor. They amended the worker. We had very strong trade unions, very strong left, and all of that sort of started unraveling. And the twin, the ascendancy of the right can be seen in two ways. One was the ascendancy of the militarization of singular Buddhist majoritarian nationalism, the militarization, and this whole neoliberal opening up, liberalizing the economy of Sri Lanka and opening it up to Western, or not just Western, Indian, Chinese, capital to come and set up. So now we have, Sri Lanka was one of the first South Asian countries to start seeing these free trade zones, garment factories, all these in South Asia. And many of the women who went to work in these are rural women. And they were lured, they were taken, they were told, and in effect, it took them, particularly if they're from the rural areas, it took them out of their home, it gave them salary and earning, and they became freer in a physical sense, because they left home, they went into the big city and lived on their own, they had their money in their hands, and it was packaged as a hugely liberating experience. But women who went there, then of course they worked in this, because in the free trade zones, all the rights, the rights that people enjoyed, the workers enjoyed within the country were suspended, because they had a different set of labor laws almost, and you couldn't unionize, And in these free trade zones, women experienced a lot of sexual violence by the managers. I mean, this is a story that you all know, but that we have heard of this happening in India or Bangladesh. But this is a story that is not often seen because it also links to the rise of the women's participation in the Sinhala Buddhist chauvinist movement. How these women are brought out of the village and they brought into the city, and then how they are mobilized, how they are how they are mobilized into these very right-wing movements. And there is almost a link. I mean, there's a link at a state level of the whole militarization, purchasing weapons, and opening up the economy to the West. And there is a link between the rise of Sinhala Buddhist chauvinism, militarization of it. I mean, it's been there for a very long time. And interestingly, I mean, I don't know whether you are aware that the 30-year war, which the Tamils waged against the Sri Lankan state, ended in 2009. It was the ending was almost of apocalyptic proportions. Within about 3 months, 40,000 people were wiped out. They were kind of caged in once part of the northeast, caged in, and then the army just bombed the hell out of the population. And it's interesting because recently there have been 2 demonstrations in the north and east of Sri Lanka where the Tamils predominantly live. And these 2 demonstrations were in solidarity with the Syrian people, because I think people are reminiscent, they're thinking about their own experience. This ended in 2009. And post-war, there is another phase of this whole neoliberal story into Sri Lanka. And what that is, after the 2008 financial crisis, I mean, I see all these movements being very integrally and very fundamentally linked to the sweep of neoliberal developments in throughout the world. And 2008 financial crisis here, and you saw a flight of capital into what they called the emerging markets. So you have Sri Lanka, India. India is a huge economy. Sri Lanka was definitely a little part of these emerging markets. So we have a huge spike in capital, finance capital, and that meant when the banks came. Now today, the government, the banks, the institutions, and the individual people, down to the rural people, are indebted to banks, to banks in the global West. So this is what is happening, and there was this kind of aggressive selling of these loans, and the foreign capital doesn't come and set up factories, or there is no commodity production for trade. What happens is they come and they want to lend money to people, and it has been so aggressively done in the north and east post-war, because post-war there were so many women-headed families because the men died or left the country, or they were abandoned. And this is what happens in a post-war situation. I mean, you come to the north and east of Sri Lanka and you see, a woman who might have been living in a 2-bedroom cement brick house now lives in a tin shack because her house was razed to rubble. So then, aggressive selling of these loans, debt, money is a commodity there. I mean, they're selling these loans to these people, and then the banks, the police, the whole bureaucratic structure is in a very violent way. I mean, women hiding, women committing suicide, women running away from the village because they want to, because this loan has to be extracted. They can't. If you're living in a tin shack, you get a 5 lakh rupee loan to build your house up a little bit, and then they can't pay it back because there's no livelihood. And because the economy is not being, I mean, it's the same story. Like if you go to the north of England, what we see is in a different way, in a far more poverty-stricken situation with no welfare safety net for these people. So in that context, there is a lot of violence. The goons, the banks have hired people to go and extract these loans, and a woman can get away from. She can default on this month's payment if she sleeps with a guy who comes to extract the, there's a lot of sexual violence in that context. So this is a story that is not told often. And I want us to discuss this, how all these financial developments globally, how it translates in the global south, in these very fragile economies.
Okay, I mean, that's actually really a very interesting point. I mean, this is one of the things we feel in our organization, South Asia Solidarity Group. We tend not to use the word fundamentalism, partly because fundamentalism has its own baggage, which is always Muslim fundamentalism. But quite apart from that, these, the right-wing parties and forces which have come up in recent times are thoroughly modern. They have shaped themselves around neoliberalism. And we see this, of course, in India, and something which I meant to mention after Isabel's talk is that, we wonder what are the economic reasons why these attacks are taking place. And the whole of the area, the Rakhine state, for example, there's oil and gas there. And big multinationals operating, both from China, PetroChina, and a number of other multinationals, as well as FDI loans, where you have the Burmese government also doing the same thing. Plus you have all the major American multinationals, like Coca-Cola, Pepsi, Harley-Davidson, a whole bunch of others. So, this is the kind of base which is creating this kind of militarization and violence. So I'd like to go on. I think Meena now wants to say something. So,
Yeah,
do you want to say something about this? I thought you would go on to the
Yeah,
next.
no, I have something to say, but I can come back.
Okay.
Yeah,
No, sure. I mean, we can finish it.
No, yeah, you can finish it.
Okay. I also just wanted to go back to what Goldie was saying, just kind of reiterate the point about what does it really mean, what does the rise of right really mean in terms of in the context of Kashmir, and it's like a very in the Kashmiri state of mind, it's very obvious that the rise of BJP in the state isn't anything new because they look at Congress and BJP are more or less in the same way. For Kashmiris, we do think that the BJP coming into power in Kashmir is a good thing for the Kashmiris in some sense, because then the mainstream and the liberal India can actually see what the Congress was already doing in Kashmir. So for us, there is no difference between the Congress or the BJP. So just kind of reiterating that point about this is very old school for us. This is something that's been happening from the 90s onwards, starting from the Mubina Akhtar case, which happened in the 1990s, where this woman who was in a wedding bus was going back from the wedding party from the reception back to their village, and the bus was stopped by the army, and there was shooting on the bus, and the aunt of the bride and the bride were raped and again shot multiple times, etc. So this started way back, and then obviously we know about Kulan Poshpura and also, and just kind of talking about the systematic use of armed forces oppression in Kashmir with the Armed Forces Special Powers Act, and how the army has impunity in Kashmir. That is very important to recognize. It's something super obvious, but I think in India and the liberal Indians sometimes just don't recognize how the army uses this violence against women in Kashmir, and how the occupation in Kashmir is gendered to a very large extent. So this is obviously the macroaggression, but I also want to talk a little bit about the microaggression that the army or the state or the occupation has in terms of the gendered microaggressions. So there's this really amazing piece in Guernica about when crackdowns used to happen in the 90s or early 2000s in Kashmir. So crackdowns is when the whole village or the town would be kind of cordoned off, and all the men who look above a teenage age would be brought to the town center and then checked basically to see if there are militants or not. And the women would be made to stay at home. But what the army would do is go to the houses and then basically strip search the whole house in case they were hiding any militants there. Now, how is this gender really? Of course, the women are supposed to be at home, they're protected so-called by the army, but what the army would do in these houses is
throw everything that existed in the house on the floor, including, undergarments of women, bras of women, and then ridicule them, or pads, for example, sanitary pads, for example. And so, like, these microaggressions that we don't talk about, and the psyche that it has on, like, a whole female population of the region, not just for a couple of years of war, but like systematic decades of oppression and occupation, is something that, you know, the liberal feminist Indians would not necessarily talk about. I know this sounds very like, oh, I'm really angry, etc., but then I'll also touch a little bit more about the solidarity bit of from you know, the feminists in India with Kashmiri women, and maybe the next few questions. But I thought it was important to, you know, maybe just touch upon these like microaggressions, and then also link this to Islamophobia a bit more. So there is this young Kashmiri actress in Bollywood, Zaira Wasim, who's in Dangal, and she's a very feminist movie, right? She's traveling from Srinagar to Bombay or something on the airplane, and she's harassed by her co-traveler, like this old man who's sitting next to her. And then she, being a millennial and a snowflake, as we like to call people who, you know, talk about their rights, she posted this on social media, and then the kind of backlash she got from from the media in general, and people that, oh, she's a woman, she's Kashmiri, she's Muslim, and all that comes with it. And then there was one more thing that I wanted to talk about. Yeah, the other small, you know, ingrained microaggression that I want to talk about was this very simple goalie, women's football captain from Kashmir. She's apparently a stone thrower. So like the Economic Times, Financial Times, all of them write this piece about her, about how the goalkeeper of the Kashmir football team is a stone thrower, and she's a stone thrower because she was going for her practice, and then the army something happened with some kind of, like, you know, tussle happened with the army, and then she started throwing, or she got caught in like the stone pelting, and then she started throwing stones, and she was reprimanded for that. But then also, like, the discourse around it is very much that, oh, this woman is like of not a good character because she threw a stone, and not understanding the daily violence women go through. It's not about being a good or a bad woman, because, oh, if it's a man or it's a boy and he throws a stone, he's automatically not good for the society, and he's the unemployed youth. But for a woman, it's another level of, like, you know, judgment and morality that comes with it. So I suppose we'll come to the second question that you asked about purity and Farad. So, but I thought I'd just kind of touch upon that a little bit.
Thanks, Mehroosh. That was really very interesting and very important, because, you know, this has been going on so long, and it's so true that you know, the whole question of Islamophobia and feminism is a big problem, you know, even in this country.
Absolutely.
Oh yeah, thanks to everybody for their contribution. I think coming in last, one has the benefit of being able to touch upon what everybody said. At the same time, what you wanted to say has already been said. But I would like to start from the topic about Kashmir, which is quite not immediately relevant for somebody who is from Tamil Nadu, but also highly relevant, because what we have seen in the last period is you have to constantly prove you're a nationalist Indian, because if you're an Indian woman, it's not important. You have to also go this next step further and prove that you're patriotic. And sometimes, you know, it's not just the BJP which is doing it, but it's also the state machinery in general, right from the Supreme Court of India, which said, oh, you have to stand for the national anthem just so that you show you're patriotic. And so you're all in my state, in Tamil Nadu, where people are bilingual in terms of speaking Tamil and English, but we were supposed to sing this Bengali song, Vande Mataram, which is not even an Indian song, but it was made compulsory in every school. So you have this constant superimposition of nationalism. And so in another state where I'm also, like, you know, I switch homes. So in Kerala as well, people were arrested because they did not stand up during the national anthem during a film screening, and these are things that are you know, completely at odds with each other, because people go to cinemas for entertainment. They're not going there to have their nationalism aroused, you know. So this whole you know, the way in which, and I think that this question of nationalism is very important, because a lot of people, especially, like, you talk about liberal feminists, but as a feminist, I have, and as many others, I think, have tried to call out Indian government on this, as well as call this whole idea of what is national, because you cannot have all these mass graves in Kashmir and want to be part of the same country, and you cannot have nobody talks about what's happening to Adivasi women in Bastar, because like school children, young women who go to school are being molested by the paramilitary, and we don't talk about that in the same way. Or you don't talk about, like few days ago, like I think less than a week ago, 7 women militants were gunned on Maoist, and nobody talks about who they were, and they don't even give a second name or a surname or any background or even the women's age, and so it's just like, it's just a number, but we don't know what happened or how these women died, and all of the people who are trying to investigate stories, they run after, Bollywood gossip, but they don't run after stories of finding out who these women were, whether they were like given fair treatment, what happened to their bodies afterwards. And I think, yeah, this is something that I think this question of the army is a big question, because all of this rise of the right wing in India is also linked to the glorification of the army as, the be-all and end-all. And I think one of the things is when Modi did something just hugely, in the beginning, I think a lot of people were like, oh, it's a brave step, or it's a radical step, because, all this currency was, demonetized. And one of the things people were like, oh, but talk about our soldiers. What about our soldiers? Like, oh, you're complaining for standing for 3 hours in the sun. You're complaining about standing in this queue. But look at our soldiers. They are in Siachen. They are in the freezing cold. So it's always about, oh, what about our soldiers? I think the thing is that what are these soldiers doing is also something we have to talk about, because people like in JNU, there's a vice-chancellor who wanted to put a battle tank in the middle of the university so that people become patriotic by seeing this battle tank. So we have this whole huge place where the army becomes like, it stands instead as I don't know, a replacement for Hindu masculinity. They never say this is the replacement for Hindu masculinity, but it is a coded way to push this Hindu masculinity. And I think a long time ago there was this beautiful book by someone called Omar Khalidi, who looked into the statistics of the Indian army and showed how it's largely, recruitment is largely Hindu, as well as the Muslim presence in the Indian army itself doesn't exist, and we have to look at that. So I think this is one of the things I wanted to talk about, but also the Indian army also becomes a very convenient place, because she said there is no difference between the BJP and the Congress. And I think when it comes to the army, or comes to what the army does in the name of protecting the borders, or the construction of the army itself, then Pakistan becomes the easy enemy, easy scapegoat. It becomes the easy other, and Pakistan again becomes shorthand not for a country or our neighbor, but it becomes shorthand for the Muslim. So there's always talk of the Pakistanis, and the global climate of Islamophobia allows that now Pakistan is no longer the only enemy, but ISIS has become the next easy way to talk about thing. Because one of my friend called G. Vishnu, he was like tweeting the other day, and he's following the electoral campaign of the BJP. Basically they're saying, oh, these are all ISIS people, so if you want to save your country, vote for BJP. So it's become like, oh, these are communalists, they will just destroy the country. So that's at the grassroots level, they're not talking about development, they're not talking about, oh, we are going to do this for you, we are not going to do that for you. All of the promises and all of these jobs, that's what, oh, Modi says, or that's how Modi sells himself. But at the grassroots, I think this whole fear-mongering is huge, is very huge. And I think this phobia about the ISIS is also very gendered, because yeah, Akanksha talked about the love jihad, and how love jihad is about Muslim men taking Hindu women, converting them. But it's not only about demographics, because in Kerala, when a young 22-year-old girl called Akila converted and became Hadia, which is a case that has taken national headlines, they said that she married a man called Shafin because he was working with the ISIS, so he planned to go to Syria. Had all of these theories that so he was going to be like this soldier for the ISIS, and therefore he was trying to convert this girl, and so they become like women who are converted become breeding machines. So they had this whole thing going, and this is what her father went and told the court, and the Kerala High Court annulled her marriage, and she was an adult, and it was her choice to choose her religion, it was her choice to choose her partner. But the court actually annulled a perfectly valid marriage, and just send the police and the intelligence on a wild goose chase, saying, find out the ISIS connections, because these connections are so tenuous. These connections exist in the imagination of those who want to consolidate their own Hindu hate base. So I think that ISIS becomes like a kind of proxy to talk about it, and to criminalize even more this idea of who the Muslim is. So I think it's very popular. And I think, yeah, the one incident, I've spoken on many incidents. I also want to talk a little about Tamil Nadu, where I come from, because Nirmala spoke about Tamil women, and it's very interesting because what the 30 years of militancy of the Tamils did in Sri Lanka is that it made Tamil women also look at themselves as militant, you know, like, okay, our sisters there are fighting and they're, you know, even carrying weapons, so we are strong. But now the rise of BJP is by trying to pull us like back by 100 or 200 years. So the BJP tries to, they cannot attack women because not so many women are in the public sphere in the same way. So when somebody like a very popular poet like Vairamuthu goes and says something like Andal, who is a Bhakti singer or Bhakti poet, was possibly a Devadasi, they just take a very small example and the entire BJP goes after this one man and says, oh, but how can you talk about a Hindu like this, a woman like this? And so like, oh no, she was just really into God and, you know, trying to get all the women on the street to defend this concept of Andal, the concept that she married God and trying to, you know, whip up religiosity. And it's the same thing with Perumal Murugan, and the BJP doesn't often attack directly. It uses a lot of, you know, like n number of fringe groups to do these attacks. So Perumal Murugan writes a novel. Tamil Nadu is not even a very novel reading, you know, place, but they just pick up this novel and then they're like, oh, but you talk about this woman of this caste and how she's, you know, possibly sleeping with a stranger, and then therefore you've insulted our caste, and then they want to censor this book and they want to exile this writer. So they're trying to do all of these things just, you know, in a sense that to talk about, you know, purity of Tamil women and set us back hugely, and on this purity trying to build, I think, a Hindu identity.
Yeah, to what you said about being called anti-national really rings so true. And in fact, even South Asia Solidarity Group has its share of trolls who see us as jihadis and anti-nationals and everything else.